So, Linda, there are some folks in your party that they link national security with immigration policy and particularly immigration reform and say we may not be able to have both. That if we really reform immigration in a way where there's a freer flow across the border, we know less about it, and as a result, we diminish our own national security. And I'd really like you to think about that and respond to that, and even criticize the viewpoint.
Well, I'll tell you, first of all, I'm certainly not in favor of just an open border and anybody comes and goes whenever they want to. I think it has to be orderly. I think we're a sovereign nation. We have the right to say who comes and who doesn't come. I just think that we also ought to be doing ourselves a favor economically and make sure that we can bring in the workers that we need. But part of what John said earlier, I mean, I absolutely agree with. One of the reasons you want to have a more generous legal immigration program is so that you do the checks, so that you know who's coming. And I have absolutely no problem with parts of the bill that suggest that we have to make sure that when you get a visa and it's stamped that you get to stay here for a certain period of time, that we know whether or not you leave at the end of that time. That's what I think of as interior enforcement. I grew up at a time when every January there used to be ads on television. If you were a resident alien living in the United States, you had to go to the post office and register and let them know where you were. Well, we gave up on that. We no longer follow where people are once we let them in. I think we ought to spend more time focusing on making sure that the people we let in, first of all, have had the background checks. Secondly, have the skills that we need. We need people at the high end of the skills level, those STEM workers that Senator Bennett talked about, but we also need the people to work in the poultry processing plants and in our agricultural fields and to do jobs in the service industries. But we have to make sure that once you get that legal right to enter, and it might be a guest worker, it might be in the agricultural field, if you ask the people who are coming here and who are here now whether or not they want to become citizens, first of all, they actually have less appetite for citizenship for themselves than Republicans do for them. About half of Republicans think that they ought to be given citizenship, but it's only in the 40s, 44 or something percent of illegal immigrants who think that's really important. So you know, I do want to make sure that we do know who's here, why they're here, and by the way, if they commit a serious crime, they're out. And they ought to be sent home, and we ought to be making sure that they come back. But when you ask, you know, can we ever stop that flow of drugs into the United States? Can we ever stop the cartels? It strikes me, here we have 22,000 or so people at the border, most of them on our southern borders, focusing on stopping busboys and gardeners and babysitters from sneaking across. It's a little bit like we are making the FBI out there making sure that people are not jaywalking. We ought not to be having those law enforcement officers focused on people whose crime is that they want to work to provide for their family. They ought to be focusing on those meth dealers and heroin traffickers and human traffickers and drug cartels that want to operate here in the United States. And if we had a legal way for people to come so they didn't have to spend all their time trying to intercept the guy just coming across to try to work so he can feed his kids at home in Mexico, we'd have more of those resources devoted to keeping out serious crime.
So, Senator, I'm going to take a little bit, come from a different viewpoint. There were people who were actually critical, really some from the left, that the pathway to citizenship for the most people it would be applicable to. There are 3 different pathways of citizenship. The one that would be generally most applicable is 13 years. 10 years in one status, 3 years in a second status. And there are people who are critics of that.
Yeah. So if I could just say one word on border security or on national security. It's hard to argue that the system we have right now is great from a national security point of view, you know, which is another reason we should get something done. 40% of the people, this was shocking to me, I didn't know this before I got into this stuff, 40% of the people in this country that are undocumented are people that came here legally and overstayed their visa, and we have no system, as Linda was saying, we have no system to tell us, hey, so-and-so was supposed to check out of here today, but they didn't check out, or where are they?
Which is what they have in Canada.
Which is what most industrialized countries have, and which is also encapsulated in the bill. And a final point on border security, and then I'll come to the pathway. The reason we felt that we could do it for $8 billion, not $46 billion, is because the extraordinary advances in technology that we have acquired as the result of our experience in Afghanistan, where we can see, once it's deployed, every square inch of the border in a way that we have never been able to see it before, which means we're going to be able to see a lot more of the folks that are coming across, not at border crossings, but who are smuggling, drugs one way and guns the other way, and that seems like something we ought to do. There are a lot of people that have been critical about the length of time in the pathway. I might say that it's 13 years for most of the 11 million. There are two exceptions for that. The Dreamer, the kids that were here through no fault of their own, who we put on a 5-year pathway, again, not controversial in the Gang of Eight, and ag workers, because a deep concern that they wouldn't have an incentive to stay in agriculture if we had the longer pathway, so we made that 5 years too. First immigration bill in our history where the ag jobs part of it has been endorsed by both the Farmers Union and the growers all across the United States. That's never happened before. I understand the criticism, and it is a tough pathway. So for people who say it's a special pathway, it's special in the sense that no one else has ever had to confront a pathway like this. You have to confess to you committed a crime, you have to pay a fine, you have to go through a background check. If you don't pass the background check, you go home. 6 years later, you have to go through another background check. And finally, when you get to your 10th year, you can get a green card if you can show that you are earning a living in the United States or you're not a public charge in the United States, which means we don't have to support you. And you can show that you're learning English, and you can show that over this period of time you haven't been convicted of a crime. Then, and only then, and after we do all the border security stuff I talked about earlier, can you get a green card and then 3 years from that be able to get your citizenship. As a political matter, there's been some concern about, maybe these people are going to become voters for one party or the other party, and that's a reason to slow this down. My worry is, I think the real question the real debate we're having is not about a special pathway or not. The question we're really having is, are we going to make it a bar for all time that somebody came here in an undocumented way? And people can have a principled argument about that. I think that's a lousy idea from the standpoint of the United States, because most of the people that came here that were undocumented, we wanted them here to drive our economy. That's why they were here. And second, I don't want us to turn out to be, look like one of these European countries where you've got a group of people in the geography that do not have a commitment to the future of the democracy or the future of the economy because they're kept out perpetually. Maybe 13 years isn't the right. Maybe we've got harder and tougher things we can do for people. Maybe there are other things, but the idea that we would say no to this very American idea, I think we will regret. But I will tell you this, we may not get it done right now. I think we will get it done before the next presidential election. We may not get it done right now, but I think it is inevitable that it's going to happen because the demographics in this country are going to make it absolutely impossible for people that are elected to Congress in Washington from most places to oppose this pathway. My view is we might as well do it now.
Could I just say one thing on that? Because this is something I've been writing about for 30 years, which is Hispanics and the Republican Party. We have this vision that Hispanics are all Democrats, they're all liberals, that's the way they vote. As I've reminded people over and over again through my columns, in the last 11 presidential elections, 8 out of those 11 elections, 1/3 or more of Hispanics have voted for the Republican candidate. That included Richard M. Nixon. It included Ronald Reagan. In fact, Ronald Reagan had tied George W. Bush for the highest percentage of Hispanic vote, which was about 44%. This idea that somehow Hispanics are in bed with one party or another is just simply wrong. Hispanics, like most Americans, diverge in their political point of view. And if you want to look to the group who Hispanics most resemble in a lot of ways demographically, it's Italian Americans, who now are a majority Republican. If the Republican Party were doing what Ronald Reagan and George W. Bush did, and Richard M. Nixon did, which was to reach out and talk to them and try to attract them, I think the Republican Party would be getting a much larger share of the Hispanic vote. And that vote is going to be increasingly important. A quarter of all children in America today are Hispanic. I mean, that is a demographic time bomb if the Republican Party becomes identified as the anti-immigrant, anti-Hispanic party. Then it's going to go the way of the Whigs. We are not going to have a Republican Party capable of winning national elections unless we can reach out and attract. And by the way, when they do public opinion polling on how you view yourself, liberal or conservative, Mexican immigrants are actually more likely than Americans in general to define themselves as conservative. 35% compared to about 32% of non-Hispanic whites who describe themselves as conservative. So there is no political reason for the Republican Party to be as worried as they are about these new citizens. They are, in increasing numbers, likely to vote Republican.
And I think you've said in your columns they agree often on social issues.
Absolutely.
They certainly care a great deal about education. They care a great deal about health care reform, but don't necessarily identify with the Democrats on those kinds of reforms. And they might either way.
And they're very
but they
suspicious of government because many
Yeah.
of them come from countries where government are not the good guys.
Right.
So, that is one of the reasons why, the Republican Party could be a very attractive alternative, in addition to many of these people being very entrepreneurial. The act of leaving a country where your family, is, where you're comfortable, where you know the language, and to take off on an adventure to come to some place where you don't know anybody and you don't know what's going to happen, that requires a kind of entrepreneurial spirit that makes the people who come here very special. We get the best of the best, and that is because of the nature of immigration itself, that it takes that kind of entrepreneurial act in order to strike out to a new world.
So I've got a little earpiece, and the little earpiece just told me that we've come to the end of our time. I think as a co-host of this, Senator, I'd like to give you the last word before I have the last word.
Well, I would say thank you to all of you, and thank you to the panel for being here. And this is among a number of issues that I think we would be just fine solving if we could figure out a way to align Washington's politics to Colorado's politics. I really mean it. I mean, there's not a place in this state that I worry about talking about the importance of this legislation. And I guess what I would close by saying is that in addition to all the other good things about it, the Congressional Budget Office tells us that it's 3 points of additional GDP growth in the first 10 years, 5 points of additional GDP growth in the second 10 years, and it'll help define our economy in the 21st century at a time when we need to compete like crazy to create good jobs with good wages here in the United States. So thank you.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Senator.
Larry.
So I think it is just a terribly difficult issue, and particularly in Washington, D.C., it's going to be a difficult issue to move on it this year, but maybe before the next presidential election. But I do think that the people of Colorado have a lot to say about this, care a great deal about it, and the most important thing is probably to communicate with those people who you elect to federal office your sentiments about this, so that and even in this election cycle, people understand that this is an issue that needs resolving. We've really benefited from some subject matter expertise on this stage tonight, and I, as your moderator, appreciate how well you did. And thank you all.
Nice
Thank
job.
you, Bill.
I'd like to thank our very, very distinguished panel. This was a spectacular event, and these are issues all of us need to pay attention to. Have a nice evening, and God bless all of you. Thank you.